Hello everyone, welcome to the Creative Help Podcast. My name is Francoise Helene. I'm a poet, author, early years teacher. And on this podcast, we talk about the power of arts, music, literature, nature, and creativity on health and well-being. In this podcast episode, I'm very honored to speak with Thomas Kaddor, who is a lecturer in creative health at University College London. He has a background in chemical engineering, archaeology, and of working with people who experience drug addiction and homelessness. His long-standing interest in material culture, for example, the objects and the things that we humans use to construct our world, has led him to explore the relationship between material culture, learning, and well-being. Thank you so much for joining me on this podcast episode on object-based learning and well-being. I reached out to you just because I was really curious about object-based and how that can relate to well-being, because I feel like it's something that we don't really hear about much. Definitely before I met you, that's something that I wasn't really aware of. So I'm just curious to know what got you into that type of research. So why did you want to learn more about object-based? Where did it start for you?
Okay, yeah, and thanks for inviting me, first of all. And I'm always happy to talk about some of these things that are, very, very close to my heart, I guess. So when we talk about object-based working, whether it's in learning or well-being, just in brief terms, I guess we talk about working with what people sometimes refer to as material culture. But in broad terms, it's everything that we as humans tend to construct our worlds with. Right? So there is, and we are unique among the animal species as humans. There are obviously other animals that are using objects to some degree. There's some primates that can be taught even to make stone tools. There are birds that build nests and so on. So there is use of objects among other animals. But what there isn't is the extent how material culture permeates everything we do as humans, right? There's no interaction between people that's not mediated by some objects, right? Objects are everywhere. We build our world with objects, and so they make our world because we make our world with objects in a way. I think that's sort of where it starts when we talk about object-based approaches, is really to think about all the stuff, right, that makes our lives, that we use to construct our identities and ourselves and how we engage with the world. And because of that, I think it's sort of inevitable that being conscious of the role of these material things is really important in understanding how we engage as humans with ourselves, with each other, with the world, and therefore that must have an impact on well-being. But so personally, this started in a way for me. I have a background first in chemical engineering, but then I sort of left that partially behind and went into archaeology. And when then after a few years, when I started doing a doctorate in archaeology, I became a tutor, which is sort of the common practice that you start teaching undergrads when you're doing your PhD. And what struck me is, given how physical and material focused in my books archaeology is and should be, what was striking for me was how theoretical the education was that I was part of. And so one of the first things I did as a tutor, I accidentally, I think, because I was working there was a small collection in the department I was working in, and I was working with some of the objects, and I came across this box of teaching objects, right? And nobody had ever used this. I hadn't seen that as an undergraduate student, but so there was a small collection there And I just dusted that down and went through it and started bringing that into my tutorials, right? Like in the undergrad, students play with some of the objects. And it really was, that was, I guess, when I got the bug. From that point onward, so the first time I started working as an educator, even though I was still a student, was essentially the first time I worked with objects. And ever since, I find it very difficult. Of course, there are certain things that are more theoretical in the way I teach and the way I work in higher education. But I find it very difficult to separate my role as an educator from my role as a mediator of material culture, because they've been so entrenched from the very start. And so ever since I started working in higher education, that's been a key factor, I guess. And it became so obvious to me how the difference that makes when students have physical things to reference their ideas and thoughts with. Mm-hmm. And it benefits greatly from a learning perspective. And that's why I obviously kept doing it. If the first time it went really badly, then I probably would have never done it again. I would have never touched objects again. But because it was so striking, the impact that made compared to, talking to students about literature and readings and all of that is important, but actually making it concrete with some physical objects made a real difference. And then fast forwarding, I guess, several years, I got a job in UCL, I guess, and that was initially in the department that runs the museums and collections. That was my first job in UCL. So it was because of my background in working with objects, because the idea was they needed somebody who could mediate between the world of collections and the world of education at UCL. So I was then essentially still working on that interface of learning and objects. But what over the years I observed more and more was that, yes, clearly there's a great learning benefit. But what I found almost most striking is the other benefits that people who learned with me with objects identified. And that is kind of more broadly benefits to their well-being, that they found it less stressful, that they found it actually fun and engaging. And also what I found really interesting is that I did some work, for example, with primary school students, bringing objects and archaeological projects into school classes and so on. And in particular, my work would have focused on schools from relatively economically underserved communities and so on. And what I found striking is that sometimes, we had students who really took to this and primary kids, right? And engaged really with the objects and were brilliant at it. And then not infrequently, the teacher would come up to us afterwards and say, this is actually one of our problem students. This is one of the students who find it difficult to engage. Sometimes students who experience specific learning differences and so on seem to be the ones that really benefit from bringing objects in, because it just breaks the mold of traditional sit down, listen and take note education, right? So it allows us to engage with all the other senses. And I think that's the real benefit, is that sensory engagement. And so observing that there's the learning benefit, but also the well-being benefit. That really then started me off on that new journey, or the extended journey of object-based work into the world of well-being from the world of learning, if you want. They kind of go hand in hand. But I guess you might want to ask a follow-up question. I don't know how clear that was, but as an answer. But anyway, I'll hand back to you.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's really interesting because it seems like it's been quite a long journey for you that keeps on expanding, and that's taking you from a place to another. But I'm curious, if we go back to the first time where you brought objects for the other students. I think you said you were still a student at that time as well. And I'm just curious to know, what was their response? Because it might be something that they were like, oh, this is quite unusual, or what are we meant to do with these objects? So what did they do when they saw the object? Were they just staring at the object and kind of writing about them? Or were they, I don't know, just talking? Because I guess it would be a great objects can start conversations as well.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit more about that? Like how people respond to the objects when they see them? Do they know what to do with them?
That's really interesting. And I think in many ways, we're so used to objects of all sorts that instinctively we know to do something with them, right? Even if they're completely strange and unfamiliar objects. And I think unfamiliar objects are some of the best objects to introduce both in a learning and potentially a well-being context. We can go back to that. But if I go back, and this goes sadly back a while, we're talking 2006, I'm guessing 2005, 6, 7. That I had these initial explorations when I was, doing my doctorate and starting to teach in university. And so these would have been first year undergraduate students, so in archaeology, so kind of grappling with the basic concepts. So therefore, one thing I did, for example, is we had this selection of stone tools in the collection, which most people don't find particularly inspiring, right? With small bits of worked stone from the Stone Age, so from 4, 5, 6, 7,000 years ago. But what I, for example, got the students to do was just to build a sequence, right? Tell me which is the oldest, which is the youngest, and almost instinctively, without too much background, the students were able to do this, but they could then also reference the things they had been learning in the more formal theoretical lectures, right? They could link the images they would have seen on slides and the stuff they would have read in the textbooks to some of these objects, and how and in archaeology, I guess, this idea of a chronology, of a typology of objects that's from the oldest to the youngest is foundational, right? It's one of those things that we call in education a threshold concept, and that sort of goes back to the foundation even of the discipline, that this idea of dividing the past into these different ages of stone, of bronze, of iron, and so on. And it links directly to that. But it's something I've taken forward, and occasionally I still get to teach. I'm largely in arts and sciences and obviously in creative health, but occasionally I still get to teach a class or two in the Institute of Archaeology in UCL as well. And the class they get me to do is always on dating and chronology. And what I've changed that exercise over the years. And what I get the students to do now is I go around the class and ask students to hand me their mobile phones. Right. And then when I have 10, 12 mobile phones, I ask the class to build a chronological sequence of those phones.
Right. Okay.
Because and they can do it. Right. It's so sort of inbuilt into us that everybody can tell whether they like it or not. An iPhone 4 from an iPhone 5 or 6 and so on. And then map that with Android phones and so on. And we built together in less than a minute a sequence, a typological sequence of these phones. But it's a really important principle that we can do that when we compare two objects. We can make some judgments about them, right? And one of those judgments is which looks fresher, which is older, which is newer. And then we can obviously extrapolate that, and we have 10 or 12 objects. But all we do is we compare any two of them, and we build that sequence. But that tells us something about the world around us, right? And each of those objects has a history with it, whether that's a prehistoric stone tool or a mobile phone that's less than a year or two old, right? But we can still take those same principles into that environment, and everybody can do it. You can it's not really rocket science, but we are so astute. We are so clued into working with objects as humans from the day, literally from the day we are born, right? Or very soon afterwards, our parents hand us objects, whether these are toys, rattles, suitors, so we are brought up, we indoctrinated from day one into this object-rich world, and therefore we are experts, even if we don't realize it. We're experts of making judgments about them. And that's what I think. That's why I think they're so useful. What I think is odd that so much of education has become, and it's not always been like that, but it's largely over the second half of the 20th century that so much education has become so theoretical, right? That we've taken the objects out of education. That we think it's best to talk at young people largely, and use things like text-based, like reading, talking at them, taking notes, without actually engaging with the practical world around us very much. And I think that I think is odd, because we are such material people in every other walk of our lives. So why not draw on that strength that we have? That we are all material experts. We just don't know it very often because we don't pay enough attention to it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Like you said, the world that's built around us, from like the buildings to like the smaller objects, and that we're surrounded by it, and we can't really avoid it. And even like you were talking about stones as well. So even in pure nature, we'll find some sort of objects as well, like the stones themselves and the sticks. These are also objects that we can use. And that just kind of inspires me actually to try an exercise with the children at the forest school.
Yeah.
To like, I don't know, find like what, which one's the oldest leaf, or I'll think about something like that. But yeah, it's quite a good idea actually. Yeah. But can you tell us a little bit more details about the well-being side of things? So what kind of happens? I don't know, like in your research, did you had any findings about well-being? Like what happens when people interacted with objects or engage with them? Are they happier, or do they feel better? Is it like emotional release? I mean, I have tried it myself, right? So I was looking at a fossil, I think, of a fish. And for me, it was just, I wrote like a short story about it. It was like a 2-page short story about it. But I realized when I was writing about that fossil, it brought me back to childhood memories, because I grew up by the sea, and I always found the sea inspiring. I used to just go there for long walks, and just enjoy that calmness. So for me, I remember when I was writing about that object, afterwards, I felt more like energized. Like that was it for me. So I can really relate to, if I compare it to just sitting down and listening, sometimes personally I'll kind of drift off and dream a little bit, and get lost in my own thoughts. But yeah, I can really relate to when there's like something new. It kind of evokes new thoughts as well. It brings like a different learning approach. And I think for me, that experience just made me feel very relaxed. And I think there was also almost like a sense of emotional release. And I went back to memory land as well, but it was positive memories for me. So I can imagine that would not be the same for everybody. But yeah, if you could tell us a little bit more about objects and how they can help with our well-being.
Yeah. So where do I start? And you've touched on lots of interesting points there already with your experience. But so as I said, as myself and other people I'm working with, including, for example, Helene Chatterjee, who sort of was my first line manager, who hired me at UCL. So we had similar experiences, I guess. We both worked with objects, and largely actually with heritage objects, with museum objects. And it's really important to say that this kind of work on object-based learning or well-being is not limited to those kind of objects that are in curated collections. You can do it with, as I say, with mobile phones, for example, with modern objects, with personal items. So there's lots of things. But both of our experience was sort of in that field of heritage collections and museums. And we both worked primarily, although in different disciplines. So I came from the archaeology side, Helen from the biology, from zoology and natural history collections. But we both used material culture heavily in learning, right? In teaching and learning. But we both had this independently, this experience that while we did this, that students and learners more generally experienced some well-being benefits, and they expressed that. So it's anecdotal initially, if you want, but people continuously express that. As I said, with the more difficult, the disruptive students in primary school settings, for example, they were anything but disruptive. They were the most engaged sometimes. They were really clued in because they found a new language for them, a new way of engaging. So we had this anecdotal experiences ourselves and from colleagues who did similar things, where learners identified really, I really enjoyed this. I feel much better after having this session, this handling session with some objects. So we thought there is something there that needs to be actually properly explored and properly researched, because that research didn't exist. There was growing body. Object-based learning as a field itself is quite a young field of research, goes back maybe a decade and a half, 2 decades. And then the object-based well-being is even more recent in a way. So there was nothing there. And then what Helen and her colleagues did around the time when I joined UCL, and then we continued this work, is, for example, thinking about different settings where material culture could benefit people from a well-being and a health perspective. And they put together some boxes of objects and trained up volunteers to bring them into care settings, into hospital settings, for example, in different settings, and then allow people who usually don't get the possibility, especially these were people who couldn't leave the hospital, who were too ill, either they were in palliative care in a cancer ward, or in an enclosed psychiatric unit where they secure psychiatric unit where they weren't allowed to leave, or people who just couldn't physically get out of bed for whatever reasons they were in hospital for. And therefore we had hospital staff and other volunteers bring them some objects. They had usually a box of objects with 5, 6, 7 different items, and then the person could choose an object. Completely whichever, there was just a box there, and the volunteer would just say, which of those would you like to handle? Which of those would you like to? And then you could free associate. And it was really striking then. And there was obviously a proper research element to that then people were asked about this later on, but also that free association is really interesting. And that it was very striking how people identified that it allowed them to forget about the environment they were in.
Right.
And usually every interaction in that hospital is about their health, right? Any conversation they have with family who comes in, any conversation they have with the staff in the hospital, it's all about them and their bodies usually, and their health or mental health, them and their minds in that case. But everything is focused on the person, whereas this allowed them to focus on something else, right? And interestingly, then, or almost ironically, by focusing on something completely different, it allowed them to express things about themselves and their health as well, and their bodies, that they wouldn't have expressed in these normal conversations that were specifically targeted at them and their health, right? For example, there's a wonderful, they're very difficult, but wonderful quote that I sometimes bring into classes when I talk about this, where we had, interestingly, the very type of object I started teaching with, a stone axe. This is a very old kind of middle Stone Age object, so going back 200,000-300,000 years, very old object. And this person was drawn to that object, and that was a woman in a palliative ward in a cancer unit, right? So she was sadly just there to be. It was almost hospice care she was receiving at that stage. There was no more treatment available, and so she picked up this stone axe and started talking about how this is a weapon, and that's why she was drawn to it, because she could destroy stuff with it. She could maybe even destroy her cancer with it. But also the object makes her feel powerful. It puts her back in charge, because it's like a weapon and she can hold it in her hand and feel more powerful. And when all these sessions, because they were in a hospital, there was care staff around, right? And the care staff, the nurses and carers, were completely blown away because this person was always putting on a brave face, right? When they were asked about, so the interactions before them were very transactional, but she would barely talk even about her pain, never mind open up completely about how she felt about her disease. Mm-hmm. And this allowed her to communicate that. And what we found, this is a nice anecdote, but actually what we found as part of the project is that communication between patients and staff improved. Mm-hmm. When you bring in the objects, because especially if it was the staff who was part of that conversation with the object, because it allowed them to talk about something else, and it took the focus away from the patient and the patient's body or mind, onto the object. Yeah, but it would still, the conversation would still relate to what's going on and why they're in hospital, but it would just take that focus away, make people less self-conscious, and that's really striking, that people can project things into objects and it makes it less threatening.
Yeah.
So that's definitely one of the of the sides of it. There's also more of a maybe a healing, more general. So there's that you can project stuff and it takes focus away from you, but there's also a more general healing side. And if you look, you realize that actually people have been aware of this for a long time. Hence, if you think about medieval hospitals, they were all full of paintings and artworks and frescoes and sculptures, right? So this goes back 1,000 years potentially into the Middle Ages, that art was always around in settings of care. Yeah. And in the 1850s, 60s, whenever the Crimean War was, Florence Nightingale identified that when she was nursing people in a hospital. For example, there's this very famous Santa Maria della Scala in Siena, which goes back to the 1440s. And there's this medieval hospital, this pilgrims hall, really richly painted. And what Florence Nightingale expressed is that it's the brilliancy of color and the variety of forms of objects that can represent actual means of recovery to patients. So she said that already in 1860. So that's there. So she's talking about how beautiful objects make a real difference to people's lives. So that's sort of this sense of awe that you have. And again, something else to look at than just a television or a white hospital wall. Yeah. And it relates a little bit to Ulrich's work in the 80s, who researched that what's going on outside people's windows in hospitals made a difference, right? If they looked at trees, as opposed to a wall, they would leave hospital on average, and that's a large sample size, so it actually makes a real difference. On average, over nearly 2 days earlier, they would recover quicker from surgery, for example, than people who look at a wall. So people look at nature outside the window, recover quicker. And similarly, you could probably make similar suggestions with people who have interesting art and interesting objects in their environment, as opposed to just a bland instruments and architecture of a normal hospital. So that it makes a real difference. And obviously, art in hospitals has really taken off for that reason, that everybody knows. It makes a difference, not just to the patients, but also to the staff, the visitors. It makes a better environment for everybody. And that's down to that. So less aggression, there's less, there's less aggression towards hospital staff, for example, in environments that are full of art and objects, as opposed to very clinical, plain environments and so on. So there's lots of benefits there. And as I said, so that was starting out on this heritage in hospital and touching heritage projects. We then flipped it around and worked with people who are not in hospital, but also have some support needs, and allowed them to come into collections, into museums, and engage therefore with a greater variety of material culture. And again, the effects are really striking of all of those projects. So that's sort of the development of the journey. And now we've taken it completely back and said they've worked in these settings with lots of people, bringing objects into hospitals, bringing, for example, older socially isolated adults into museum settings. And one target audience that we hadn't really engaged with, but is definitely equally in need of some support, by young people. And for example, the young people going to higher education institutions, right? Like our students who we know have very many serious mental health challenges, anxieties on the rise, lots of other challenges going on. So the most recent research that we have done is actually going back into our own institutions and looking at the health and well-being benefits that students can derive from working in museum spaces, from working with our collections.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We'll have it's going to cut in 6 minutes, by the way. So maybe we'll try to wrap it up.
Yeah.
No, that's really interesting. I think for me, I also use art, especially paintings. When I look at a painting, I feel so much more relaxed as well. And I think that's an absolutely important point that you bring about, how art in hospitals can not only be beneficial to the patients, but also to the staff members as well. So it kind of creates that lighter environment for them too. I'm just curious, could you tell us a little bit more about the initial selections of the objects, and what's the process like when you decide to bring a group of objects in the hospital? How do you select which objects to bring, or is it quite random?
Well, not entirely random, but you obviously, I think it's key to have a variety. If you want to give people a choice, that you have 5 or 6 very different objects, and they need to be safe, both to handle, but also the person shouldn't feel paranoid that they might be breaking it, right? So the objects need to be, in a way, and again, what you don't want, because very often in museum settings, we ask students to handle everything with wearing gloves, but we don't want to do that in a hospital setting, because there's plenty of people wearing rubber gloves in hospitals, and it just inspires all the wrong things, right? So therefore, we needed to select objects that were safe from every perspective for the object, for the person to handle, that were robust enough so they didn't need to wear gloves, they didn't need to feel paranoid about damaging them, but they also told interesting stories and were inspiring, interesting to tactile. Interesting to touch, but also interesting to look at. So a combination of things, but that's sort of the selection criterion, if you want. And they had stone objects, pottery, clay objects, and metal objects as part of that. So a range, if you want.
Yeah.
And one thing actually that people really also benefit from is there's a level of trust there, right? And the level of feeling privileged that somebody would trust them, giving them a precious old object. Even that in itself, that process, that I'm trusting you to take care of this, makes a huge difference. So being able to handle something that a person over 100,000 years made, for example, is or even somebody in ancient Egypt 5,000 years made. That is awe-inspiring, and people feel really privileged that they are allowed to. Giving them permission, in a way, is a really important element of that. Giving them permission to do this. They feel the benefit even from that.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. You mentioned the touch as well. How an object feels as well. So that kind of activates another of our senses as well, which is very, I don't know. I think this is something that we could probably talk, have a separate whole conversation about, but I would just be curious about, the smell of the object. For example, I'm thinking about an antique book, just because I love in general, how that would affect us as well. And just that sense of touch. I'd be very curious to know how that can impact us.
Touch is really my thing. I know less about smell and other senses. And with many of the object smells, they all have a smell, but there are lots of different elements there, and most museum objects don't have a very striking smell, right? But interestingly, we are running a workshop in a couple of weeks on all the senses, in particular focusing on smell, sound, and touch, because they're always underprivileged compared to sight. Vision is always privileged. But touch is the one that most interests me in many ways, and we are, again, that's one of the things we are unique among the animals. Is that our tactile senses, and especially in our fingertips, right? The receptors we have are unique, are second to none. No other animals can receive that much information to touching something than we can. And again, that's very often neglected, but we have really fine tactile receptors. And that's why, so these are great. Our fingertips are amazing analytical tools, and that's something we forget about quite a lot. So I think that's really important, and obviously really important for people who are visually impaired, for example. They can get so much information. So if you train yourself, you can get so much information just through your fingertips, which is really striking.
Yeah, it's very intriguing, and it's more inclusive as well.
Yes, and that's the idea. Is the more of the different senses you can engage with, allow people to engage with, the more inclusive it gets. Because there are people who are visually strong, and there are people who are stronger hearing things, and there are people who are very kinesthetic, who want to touch and try things out. And if you allow for all of those senses, then there will be something there for everybody to engage with. I think that's really important.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for sharing your insight and knowledge with us. It's been really interesting and very insightful. I just have a last question. I'm just wondering if you have any advice or suggestion for anyone who would like to experience and engage with, that object-based learning, and see how it can help their well-being as well. Like where would they start, for example? Because as you said before, it can be just any objects. It doesn't have to be something from a museum. It can just have any objects that you have at home. But how do you go about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's in a way, it's very simple, because objects are omnipresent, right? They're all around us. And I don't know if you discussed in one of the other episodes, the 5/6 ways to well-being. One of them is take notice, right? And that's exactly the first thing to do, in a way. And it's also about taking the pace out of our lives. Tend to be very fast paced, right? We get instant information on our phones. We get updates on everything. Everything has to happen within a relatively short time frame. We don't.
Yeah.
And it's not that we have declining attention spans. Sometimes you hear that. I don't think that's quite true. But it's just that there's so much demand placed by our environment and on our attention that we are so readily distracted. So one thing is to actively work against that, right? And take your time, take the pace out of things, and engage slowly and thoroughly with one thing, right? And we call that slow looking. Right. There's a whole book written by a colleague from Harvard called Shari Tishman on slow looking. I talk to my students regularly about this idea. It came from the art history word, from the fine art word, slow looking at paintings, but you can do it with any object, especially what is interesting if you do that with an unfamiliar object. But even if you take, there's an example, for example, of a Big Mac box, right? And just have that sitting on the table in front of you, or a paper cup for that matter, and just write down all the things you can notice about it and that come to mind by just looking at that one object. Even that works. But it works best with unfamiliar objects, right? Objects that you never really paid attention to, or something that you had never seen before, or with artworks as well. So that's what I would encourage people to do, is to focus on that, right? So the next time, for example, you happen to find yourself in a museum or gallery setting, don't run through it and try and see everything.
Yeah.
Place yourself, sit, stand, whatever is most comfortable, in front of one thing, and spend time there. At least 5, 6, 10 minutes. You could do as long, see how long you can last, right? So that's definitely one thing. So it's take the pace out, take notice.
Yeah.
Another thing that's great for engaging, especially with things that you can't touch, like in a museum context, when you're sadly not allowed to touch things very readily, is to draw. Even if you don't rate yourself, I'm not rating my artistic credentials in any way. But it's actually using drawing as a way of engaging with the world, as a way of knowing and meaning making. And that allows you also to use your fingers and to use your tactile sense, even though you can't touch something. So that's definitely another good thing. And you can combine those, right? You can look slowly and draw. But as you do this, you might as well, if something else comes to mind, you want to write something down, then go for it. But just see what happens when you take the pace out of engaging with the world, and that's by focusing on one thing for a prolonged period. So I think that's definitely a very simple activity that you could do in almost any setting and see what happens. But when you do that, when you take the pace out and look slowly at something and engage slowly with something, play around. If you can touch the thing as well, you can manipulate it, look at it from different angles, different sides.
Yeah.
In a group setting, for example, this is something you could think about your children in the forest school.
Yeah.
One thing that can work really well as a sort of an icebreaker type of activity, because as I mentioned, even in the hospital setting, that people feel very self-conscious if you ask them about themselves. Whereas if you bring in objects, they can still tell you things about themselves, but they feel the focus is not on them. They feel less under observation.
Yeah. Yes.
And so one thing I like to do is actually ask people in a group setting, especially if they haven't met each other before, they might be a bit shy or something, to introduce themselves to one another through an object, right?
Yeah, interesting.
So it can be anything they have in their pockets or handbags or on their person. We all have objects with us wherever we go almost, right? So it doesn't need to be something prepared, but you can also ask people to bring something in. And then instead of introducing themselves, and this is me, and this is where I come from, and this is where I live, and these are my hobbies kind of thing, you actually introduce yourself by saying, this is me, this is my name, in this case, Thomas, and here is my object. And I brought this object, or I like this object, that this object means to me X or Y, right?
Yeah.
And then so that again completely changes the dynamics and how you know people. And what I find really interesting, I've done this exercise with lots of different settings, very often with people who never met each other before, but I've also done it in facilitating staff training sessions of a team. Most people have worked together with each other for 5, 6, 7 years, and they learn stuff about each other, not about the object, but about the other person that they had no idea of, an aspect to their lives, because it came up in the conversation about this object, what the object meant to them, right?
Yeah.
So that's another nice exercise if you're in a group setting, is actually introduce themselves through an object that they have with them or that they've brought with them.
Yeah, no, I can just imagine, because especially the objects that you carry with you or that you have in your home, I mean, you got them for some sort of reasons.
Yeah.
And you can relate to them as well. So I can imagine, like, for me, if I have quite a few candles, for example. So I'm not going to go in details, but I think that, I can talk a lot about my love for candle and my love for like calmness as well, and low lighting atmosphere, and like so much, So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us, and thank you again for joining us on this podcast.
No problem, and it's always happy as you can probably tell to talk about these things.
Yeah.
So thanks for having me.
So we've come to the end of this episode. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you've learned something new and that you enjoyed listening to us. If you'd like to get in touch, please do. You can reach out through Instagram. My Instagram is Francoise Helene Poetry, or just through my website, which is francoisehelene.com. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, and until next time.